Welcome to Cultivating Courage, a podcast exploring fear, courage, and stepping into a life filled with purpose, connection, and love. This week, we are joined by our guest, Ellen, and we're talking about destigmatizing mental health conditions. Is there a way to make talking about mental health as normal as talking about physical health? Also, we're chatting about the word crazy and everything that comes along with that. Stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Cultivating Courage. We are glad you're here. I am one of your hosts, Kristin Robinson. I'm the owner of Thrive Coaching Studio, and I help people look at who they are at their core, what's important to them, and live into that on a daily basis in all areas of their lives. Matt, welcome.
Thanks.
Hi.
I'm Matt Maxwell, the other host of the Cultivating Courage podcast. I'm a host of the Cultivating Courage podcast.
True. We're both hosts.
And also the author of How to Hold a Cockroach, a book for those who are free and don't know it.
Which is available on
Amazon.
So check it out, y'all.
Yeah. And if you love it, leave a review.
And if you don't.
Forget you.
Yeah, man. Our guest this week is Ellen. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
Thank you for being here. We're super jazzed. What do people need to know about you, Ellen?
Oh, wow. So I am a young 20-something person trying to figure out how to be a human being.
Yes.
I recently started a job as a paraprofessional at a school working with special ed kids, which is exhausting and also really, really teaches you how to latch on to the wins in your day.
Yeah.
I'm an artist, primarily for therapeutic purposes. I do my art.
Like visual art?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I've always wanted to write a book ever since I was 3 years old, just like Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is that just something that it's like a random dream you have, or is like in process?
No, it's like a random dream I have that's
Cool.
like in the back of my head always.
Good.
Just thought I'd throw a random dream in there.
I love it.
I can
had
throw
that
more
dream
random
and
dreams
it's just
in
about
there.
fulfilled for a long time. I was like, someday I'm writing a book. And
Yeah.
It's done.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are gathered here today to chat about all things. And
All things.
all things.
Where should we start?
All things. The
Somebody
universe,
grab a
man.
dictionary.
I mean,
Let's
you guys
start with A.
What our listeners don't understand and may not be able to appreciate is obviously we have a small conversation with our guests before we record just about what topics they might like to explore,
Yep.
the meaning behind that possibly for our listeners. And I say we're here to talk about all things because a lot of stuff came up. And I'm not sure where we're going to start. Matt?
Yeah, I don't know either. It's almost like I don't know what I'm going to say before I say it.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, I'm having that too. I think for me, it would be a good place just to start with a major part of who I am that I didn't mention is finding ways to successfully cope with mental health and mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a pretty defining characteristic of my life since I was about 13 years old. So we could start there.
Let's start there.
Okay.
So I would love to hear your view of the stigma. I can't say that word.
Stigmatization?
Yes, of mental health, and the changes you've seen from the time you were 13 to now. I feel like there have been some big changes in how we view mental health, but also still not enough. What's there for you?
Yeah, so I would say growing up as a teenager, I was dealing a lot with some pretty intense clinical depression and generalized anxiety disorder. And then there was also an eating disorder thrown in there for a couple of years, which was fun. And it was all really, really hard to talk about. And there were a couple people in my life that I could share with because they were also dealing with these things. But even then, it kind of had to be skirted around with like flowery, magical storybook type language. It couldn't just be like, this is what's happening. And then besides those people, it was a lot of like friends who just didn't know how to deal with it and were like scared of how to talk about it. And I think part of that is just being a young person, and maybe it was just being a young person 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
But you know, my hope is now that there is more mental health education happening with teenagers, just because it is running rampant. Like anxiety and depression and suicide are rampant with teenagers. And so I would really hope that there is more education happening so that friends can be supportive when friends of theirs are going through something. Now I feel like almost no stigma talking about anxiety or depression. But I also was recently diagnosed. Well, we knew I had this, but I was recently officially diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And that's where it's like, even right now, it's hard for me to say and talk about it, because that's where I still feel a lot of stigma. And I still feel a lot of like people around me will just be talking and they'll be like, oh, I'm not crazy, or I'm not bipolar or whatever. And it's like, I am like, you know,
Right.
And I feel like depression and anxiety, it's like become a lot more common, and people can kind of just talk about it, and it's something everyone knows they're dealing with. And it depends on your environment too. Like maybe in a city, it's like easier to talk about these things versus maybe more rural communities, it wouldn't be. But I think as the mental illnesses grow more intense, it's still a bigger task of like destigmatizing it and normalizing it in conversation.
Right.
So
What's in the way of us actually destigmatizing it like that?
I think fear and misunderstanding are really, really big ones. Like, even I personally believe that like the biggest thing that can help destigmatize mental illness of any diagnosis is just the people who are dealing with it talking about it, and the people who have someone in their life dealing with it talking about it. So I try and be really bold and brave and courageous in talking about it, even right now, as I'm like scared to talk about the fact that I like say that I have bipolar disorder. And it can also be that it just makes the people around us uncomfortable when we talk about it, because they don't understand it. It sounds scary. They might have only seen it as like some crazy character on a TV show. Or, you know, I was driving when I was babysitting a couple weeks ago. I had the radio on in the kids' car, and the Katy Perry song Hot and Cold came on from like 10 years ago or something. And I'm listening to it, and all of a sudden I remember this lyric that's like, someone call the doctor, I've got the case of the old bipolar. And she's just singing about being like hot and cold about some relationship or whatever. And I'm listening to this, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, this is not a productive way to treat mental illness. And it's not that anyone is crazy or anything like that. Like, that word in itself is really stigmatizing. And some of the mental health advocates that I like listening to their podcasts and stuff, I really like, they were talking about language to use instead. And I really like, they were saying like, they try and say, oh, that's wild or something, instead of saying that's crazy.
Yeah.
But I think fear and misunderstanding.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about the language piece. There's, you know, as I'm like listening to you, I'm considering the context in which the judgment occurs. Right. So, you know, there's a couple of contexts that seem interesting, like the context meaning like the set of paradigms, the set of ways we're seeing the world that has it occur with like judgment or embarrassment or shame or, you know, and there's a way in which I'm going to go like kind of deep here and philosophical, but it's like the experience I'm having is based in my context of how I think things should be versus how they actually maybe are. And that gets created through language, right? It's actually based in language. So things we say like disorder is creating some kind of context, right? Even calling it a disorder. So I'm really curious about the language piece. How actually, and I one of the things that's occurring to me is interesting is like, And yet, many medical conditions, there's probably shame around a lot of different medical conditions, just physical, different digestive things that happen, or right, there's different things that could be happening biologically for us that occur with shame, and like I don't want people to know, and it's embarrassing. But there are other things I think like not as much so. You know, if somebody's like, I have cancer, they may feel a little bit bad about that, but I think mostly it's just like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, what can we do? Anyways, I'm curious, what are the kinds of language things that come up in our cultural speaking that actually stigmatize and have people feel that kind of shame around mental conditions? Like, I'm not even sure how to speak of it in a way that doesn't create the stigma. What do you see?
It's a good question. And I haven't actually thought that much about it before now. I do think that was a really good point you just made of the disorder. And for me personally, I'm right now dealing with a lot of anger and frustration around the fact that things like bipolar are even considered like illness or disorder or what have you, like as something that's wrong.
Yeah.
Rather than just our society isn't structured to like accept all of these diverse ways of being a human being.
Yeah.
And it needs to have us be like more similar and more what its version of regulated instead of dysregulated.
Yeah.
But yeah, the language piece. I'm trying to just kind of think through like I don't know how much I can speak to the language piece, but I can speak to kind of what you're saying in the context of like our paradigm is the perspective that can make these things seem wrong. So for instance, with me personally, in my family overall, there's like a running theme of like bipolar disorder and then also like what's called PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoria disorder or something like that. It's like really intense PMS. And so for me, and this is like, I love talking about this. For me, my mood is very, very, very predictable with my monthly menstrual cycle. And I don't view anything wrong with that. And even my like doctor is like, I'm not trying to stop that for you. But in our society where it's not acceptable to take like 3 days off of work right before your period every month because you're like exhausted and just your body wants to rest because it's about to do some really intense work, that's viewed as something that's wrong because we're supposed to work 5 days a week and we can rest on the weekend. But like a woman's monthly cycle just doesn't always work like that.
It doesn't have a Monday through Friday sort of schedule.
Right, exactly. And so
doesn't it?
Sadly, no.
Unfortunately, not.
So confused. Okay.
We'll save that for another episode.
Waiting to hear back from Mother
for 10
Nature.
years, so I think I actually have some clue about that.
And then it's like right after that, like as soon as like my period will start, it'll be like I have lots of energy. That's when like the most stuff gets done during the month. And then the couple weeks in between are just kind of like, all right, I'm going along. And I view that as there's nothing wrong with that. It works so well for me, except for needing to like be consistent with work and productivity because that's what's expected in the way our society is structured. And because it doesn't fit correctly into that paradigm, it's labeled as a disorder.
Yep. Yeah. I'm just like kind of, my mind's like just going everywhere with this idea of like crazy, you know, and it's almost like there's a way in which when we say crazy or when I say crazy, like that's crazy or that person is crazy or this situation is crazy or like, I can't believe they do that at work. That's crazy. It's like the degree of craziness is the variation between how I think the thing should be and how it actually is occurring or showing up. Right. And that's what I label as like crazy.
Right. Because it's uncomfortable or not your normal. So it's like so far from that it's crazy or like nuts.
And it gets crazier the more it seems out of how I think the world should be, or even like what would make sense. Right? Then it's crazy because it doesn't make sense according to how I think the world ought to be or how people ought to be.
Absolutely.
And what do you see there?
I see a whole situation with feminism and the patriarchy, of like women often being labeled as crazy because they are othered or different from the way men have like created and made our society to be. Part of my like really strong stance that there's absolutely nothing wrong with like the way my mood cycles throughout the month is that like thousands of years ago we lived in like tribal matriarchal times where it revolved around like the woman's moon cycle, and like the society survived based on like the women being able to connect like with their body, with their menstrual cycle, and like with the moon, so that the society would know like when to move or when to plant crops or things like that. And that like we at one point in time worked 100% in according to that. And now it's just like you look at the advertisements for things related to tampons or any period products, and it's like, I hate my period so much, and like this is the worst thing that happens to me every month, and I'm in so much pain. And it's like made into a demon instead of something that can be celebrated.
Just what is.
Yeah, instead of just what is. Yeah.
Interesting. I feel like I don't know what to say about that.
Well, it's interesting. So as you were talking about this before, I think that there are parts of society that are starting to re-embrace that idea. And I don't know if you have read anything or heard of Kate Northrup, I think is her name, but she's written, I believe, an entire book about creating your life around your cycle.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it's called, but she's got several books, but I think her last one was basically like how to do more in less time. But the idea is not like productivity in the sense of every other productivity book. It's really written for women and around the idea that, exactly like you were saying, like when you get your period, you have this burst of energy and all of these ideas and like whatever. And so the book is around like
empowering that.
That's amazing.
And like recognizing that is natural and normal, and to embrace that as the way that you work. Yeah.
Cool.
This is not where we thought we would go. I was just going to say that, you guys. Well, I started the episode as we're going to talk about all things, and this was not even one of the things that was on the list that came up. I was so right.
No. And actually, it has me consider. I'm scared to talk about this.
Say it. Yeah,
okay.
It's cultivating courage.
Yes, it is cultivating courage. Well, it's actually what I hold to be a freeing. For me, there have been times where the crazy idea actually feels empowering.
For you personally?
Well, I'll share what I mean.
Yeah.
There's a way in which I think we're wired to take things personally. So I grew up with a sometimes very angry mother. And of course, as a young person, I didn't know how to receive that other than there must be something wrong with me. And so I would push back against it because, and no, I'm not that way. And there was like a realness to her anger that then I was in relationship with. And there was this moment, it took me until my junior year of high school. And my mom has lots of like traumatic history and has lived a very difficult, sometimes challenging life. And there's lots of reasons why she is the way she is, or whatever, has acted the way she's acted. And anyways, when you're young, you don't get any of that. It's all like personal.
Yeah.
And I can think of other circumstances when I was first married as a like 22-year-old. That was like the closest proximity I'd ever been to a menstrual cycle and having it like really in my day-to-day life. So there's other instances like this, and this is not just about women at all. But I had this moment when I was a junior in high school where my mom was standing outside my door. I'd locked my door in my room, and she was like screaming at me because I had once again left my socks on the floor downstairs. And it's like I had this epiphany where I was like, oh, this is crazy. This doesn't make sense to be yelling at me about. And it was actually freeing for me. Like, this isn't actually about me. There's some crazy stuff going on in her mind that has her reacting the way she is. And who knows what all of those biological factors and traumatic factors and any number of other influences. But actually getting the kind of craziness of it was freeing for me. It was like, oh, I don't have to take this personally. There's just crazy stuff going on in her mind, stuff that I can't explain, stuff that is actually not about me or my socks. And it allowed me to almost laugh and just kind of be like, oh, it's craziness. It's not so much she is a crazy person, but there's crazy stuff going on in that mind. So it actually gave me a freedom to not take it personally and to relate to her with compassion. Instead of taking it so personally and, well, she shouldn't be that way and why is she, and pushing against it. And I've had other moments of like getting like, oh, there's just quote unquote crazy stuff going on in that person right now in a way that's actually allowed me to just feel compassion for them. So I'm also aware of like, it's kind of a juxtaposition, but sometimes actually getting that like, oh, there's just wild stuff going on in this human that I don't get. And labeling that as crazy. Sometimes I've seen that as crazy, but it's not, I don't know. For me, that's been freeing. What do you guys hear in that? I don't know if it's right or wrong. I'm just aware of the juxtaposition.
I've definitely had similar situations where it's been like, for me, I'm more inclined to use the term of like, this is absolutely ridiculous. And I'm able to just laugh at like, a situation that was feeling so intense, and then it's just like, what the hell am I in right now? This is nuts. And I do completely understand the freeing power of the word crazy in that context. I still think we should find another word.
Totally.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing is that the freedom of that for me was really just in, there's way more going on here than this situation.
Yeah. Right.
Just getting that like, oh,
this isn't about my
this
socks.
is
they're
just
coming
so
from
much.
all of their stories and the things that have happened to them and their biology, and you know, there's so much more going on here than
my socks.
Than taking it personally in my socks. And so for me that was like, oh, they're crazy. This isn't about me. But they're actually, it's not just the craziness of it or that they are crazy. It was just that it was freeing to realize there's a whole bunch of other things going on, you know, in this person.
And I think that comes down to just a fault in our language, you know, like some cultures have like 8 different words for love. Right. We just have love, and it can really shortchange us and how we're trying to express our love to people. Or what is it in like, I think the like Eskimo language or something like that, they have a bunch of different words for snow because there's so many different types of snow. Yeah. And here we just have snow or flurries, I guess. Yeah. But I think it kind of comes down to like a shortage in our language to be able to represent the human experience or like certain elements of our human experience. And I think a culture's language can very much be grown and shaped around their mentality towards certain things. So our shortage of the right words to handle things that we don't understand definitely points to our uncomfortability with things we don't understand, because we never tried to like, when American English and everything was being created, we didn't like try and dig deep enough to necessarily come up with like a whole lexicon of other types of words.
Well, and it's so many things are being discovered, you know. I think part of that was as language was being created, it wasn't necessarily studied and looked at. It was one thing, you're not normal, you go over here, we don't care why, we're not going to explore why, you're just over there now because you don't fit in.
Yeah.
And now, whether it's, you know, physical medical or mental medical, we're exploring and discovering so many things. And I think it provides the opportunity now to create a new kind of way to talk about things and create a new language. Ellen, maybe you should make up a new word for crazy.
Ooh. Like in relation to mental stuff.
You heard it here first.
Or just like, you know, it's like, I mean, I in some ways, it's just like that there is a wrong way for a person to be, right? And somewhere in the background. And I think we all have things where it's like, I'm afraid to reveal this. Whether it's like something we label as a disorder or not, things that we're afraid for people to know because of the judgment that we're afraid will come from that.
Yes. I've said it before, I'll say it again on this show in a much more lighthearted way. But like, there's a reason my bedroom door is closed because my mess is hidden in there.
Yes.
Like if I don't want you guys to judge me.
Physically and allegorically.
Just physically.
No, I mean physically, but there's a way in which that's a perfect allegory.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This part of me, my door is closed to. I don't want people to know about the mess.
That's the metaphor they use for shadow work, essentially. It's like when you're cleaning and instead of actually cleaning, you just sweep things under the rug and then you have all this shadow work to deal with of the lumps under the rug or the mess behind the bedroom door.
Too afraid to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
A couple questions for you as we conclude this episode. One is, what would you like people to know about what it's like to be you?
Do you mean like what it's like to be me as someone with these
maybe with that, okay, or just in general? Like here's where I'm coming from is that what happens when we put on these labels, I think sometimes we get afraid to reveal ourselves. And also there's like we're resistant to just getting what it's like to be somebody else in a way that I think would resolve a lot of the
and
stuff.
I think there's a hesitancy to ask questions.
Yeah.
For fear of making someone uncomfortable. We don't want to overstep and we don't want to, because to the point of this entire episode, like people don't necessarily know how to ask the questions that would help them understand better and destigmatize, like,
what it's like to be me. And I want to real quick caveat with this as saying, when I was growing up, everyone was constantly saying to me, you are not your depression. You are not your anxiety. And I totally get the we are not our mental illness thing. I feel a little bit differently about the bipolar and PMDD because the ways I just function and exist in the world and my creativity flows through me and all this stuff does very much so feel in sync with what those diagnoses are pinpointing, and that's where I get a lot of frustration. So what it's like to be me with all of those ups and downs and intricacies, it can be extraordinarily exhausting. I have to be a lot more diligent and responsible about self-care than I would like to be for someone my age. But on the other hand, I get to walk around and feel like I'm seeing magic everywhere, majority of the time. And
what do you mean?
I mean, the heightened levels of energy and being that I've experienced because of what is diagnosed as bipolar disorder has just allowed me to see so many beautiful things happening in our world and in our universe This could get into the other topic we thought about talking about, very much so. But it's like I get to see, I'm constantly saying there's no coincidences. Like synchronicities are just everywhere. Everything is so intensely interconnected. And if I'm feeling really, really down, and I have those times where I'm feeling really, really down, I never feel like I'm never, ever going to come out of that, because I know that that's just a time of rest, so that I can like bubble back up and just be, again, like aware and very connected to everything around me. And that to me is magic. And that to me makes life worth living, no matter what I'm doing, whether it's a mundane job I might not love, or if it's like my dream. It's all just got like little bits of fairy dust everywhere. And sometimes then it's really exhausting to have seen all that, and I need to rest for like 3 days and not talk to people. But yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for your question. That's a good
one. I think that might be a really great place to wrap things up. I don't know how you can top fairy dust.
You really can't.
Yeah, that we could all see the world with a little bit of what's occurring around us with the fairy dust.
Yeah. And recognizing too that everything and every being is connected in some way. I think that gets to the heart of being able to see the fairy dust.
Yeah. And maybe that's like the impact of that crazy judgment, is that it puts something as separate, right?
Yes.
It separates us from.
It separates us from something that is intensely interconnected. And from here, I could go on a whole other diatribe about spirituality being stigmatized in mental illness.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that'll be our next episode.
Yeah, maybe.
Stay tuned. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
thank you
Ellen,
so much
thank
for
you so
having
much
me.
for being here. All right, friends.
Notice, practice. Let's say notice, just simply notice when and what your mind labels as crazy. And just start to notice what's happening for you. What are the judgments? What is the impact of that kind of, and taking the judgment out of your own labeling, just noticing that that's what your mind does, and see what's going on there and what else might be possible through seeing it differently.
Yeah. All right, Ellen, any last words for our listeners?
Yeah, if you have someone in your life going through something that makes you uncomfortable, be brave and step up for them, because they're the ones dealing with like 100 times more discomfort than it is for you to just ask a question. And chances are, if they're not comfortable answering the question, they just won't answer the question. But they'll probably be grateful you asked still.
Great. All right, listeners, that's another episode of the Cultivating Courage podcast. We will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us.
Hey guys, thanks for listening. I'm Matt Maxwell. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or other social media, or learn about coaching with me at thisishearthstone.com. And please check out my book, How to Hold a Cockroach, now available through Amazon. You can connect with Kristin on Instagram at Robinson Kristin, that's Kristin, or find her upcoming workshops at thrivecoachingstudio.com. Please subscribe to us wherever you listen and leave a great review.
And don't forget our practice for the week. Notice when in your life the label or judgment of crazy comes up. And maybe experiment with what other kinds of ways you could look at a situation or person.
We'd love to hear how it goes in the comments section wherever you listen, or leave us a note at cultivatingcouragepodcast.com.